admire your punctuality. Would you care for a cup of tea? I took the liberty of ordering you breakfast. Well, it's very kind of you, Inspector. Drew sat in the same seat he had been in last night, as had the Inspector and Casey, as if these were now forever their allotted places in the dining hall of the Swan and Dove. He helped himself from the pot, and took a few grateful swigs from his cup. "Did you sleep well?" Drew asked, the same familiar pleasantries the Inspector had been through with Abigail. "Yes, though I was up quite late, even after bidding yourself and the doctor good evening. I presume you saw him home safely." "Oh, yes. I'm sure he fell asleep in the passenger seat on the way home, but between you and me, I was glad. There are only so many drunken anecdotes I can politely listen to in one evening." "My sentiments exactly," the Inspector replied. "Why people see the consumption of alcohol as an excuse to open a window to their past is quite beyond my understanding." Drew nodded in agreement. "Why such a late night?" Drew asked. "It was only once I was alone in my room that I was able to write my report of the day's events and begin to develop the pictures we took." "It was an eventful day," Drew agreed. His mind retraced yesterday's journey with the Inspector. "Anything interesting from the film?" At this moment the Inspector heard the ladies' toilet door closing and Casey's familiar light step across the carpet. "Ask me again later," the Inspector confided before she was in earshot. The two men fell into a suspicious silence in their conversation just as Casey reached them. "Don't let me interrupt," she remarked, noting their sudden silence. "Unless you were talking about me, of course," she added with a hint of playfulness. "No, of course not," Drew replied, a little too quickly and a little too enthusiastically. Casey didn't try to hide a little smile. "Still no sign of the good Dr. Collins, then?" she asked, moving the conversation on. "No, I'm afraid not," the Inspector replied. "Tea?" Drew asked, picking up the pot to pour her a cup. "No thanks, Drew. I've had my fill this morning." Drew topped up his own cup and topped the Inspector's up without asking. Casey noticed and smiled. "He's got you figured out quickly, Inspector. Keep you topped up with tea." All three of them shared a low chuckle. "Tea and food. I've never seen anyone drink so much tea or eat so much," Drew embellished.
"Abigail?"
Appeared from the kitchen carrying her tray, this time loaded with 2 fried breakfasts that the Inspector had ordered. "Ah, good morning, Drew. The Inspector's ordered breakfast. Hope you're hungry." She placed the plates in front of them, followed by knives and forks, then a bottle of red sauce and a bottle of brown. Drew's eyes widened rather hungrily at the sight of the plateful of food in front of him. "Luckily, I'm starving." He picked up the brown sauce and gave the bottle an encouraging shake. Abigail looked back at the table, trying to work out if she had forgotten anything. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, to make sure. "No, that's great. Thank you so much, Abigail," the Inspector replied, preparing himself. "My pleasure." She hurried off and left the three of them alone. The Inspector and Drew immediately began tucking into their meal, while Casey looked through the window and out into the bleary morning. "What's it like out, Drew?" she asked. Drew finished his mouthful of egg. "Cold and rather overcast. No doubt there will be rain again later." "I don't think I've seen the sky since I arrived," she continued conversationally. "No, this area seems perpetually blanketed in cloud," the Inspector added. "I know. What a dreadful winter," Drew agreed. Just as the men were finishing their food, the main door of the hotel opened and they were finally joined by the doctor. Casey checked the clock over the bar, 9:30. "Ah, good morning, Doctor." Casey welcomed him warmly. "Nice of you to join us," she commented teasingly. "Good morning all, yes. Apologies for my lateness. Had a hell of a time getting the car started this morning. It doesn't seem to like this time of year." Despite his condition when they had last seen him, the doctor seemed in good spirits and showed no ill signs of the previous evening's intake of wine. "Well, I'm afraid you've missed breakfast. There may be a cup left in the pot, though it would be rather stewed by now." The Inspector pointed at it with a forkful of egg. "Not to worry. I'd rather get moving, if that suits you, Casey." "Yes, that will suit me fine." Casey stood. "I just need to pop up to my room and get my coat and bag. I won't be long." She made her way quickly out of the dining room, leaving the three men alone. "I presume you slept well, Inspector?" the doctor asked. The Inspector was used to the banal reputation of polite conversation, though he still found having to answer the same question several times a day rather tedious. "Indeed, a very comfortable room," he replied with as polite a voice as he could muster. "I presume you also slept comfortably," he added, a slight suggestion toward the doctor's alcohol intake. "Oh yes, like a log," the doctor replied, not noticing the Inspector's tone. "I am glad." Their breakfast was now finished. Drew and the Inspector began readying themselves for the day. "Now, Drew, I need to collect my things from my room and settle up before we can begin our day properly. Would you mind coming upstairs with me and helping me with my cases?" "Of course, Inspector." The two men stood just as Casey reappeared through the door to the dining room, coat on and bag in hand. "Right you are, Casey. Shall we be off?" Dr. Collins asked. "Of course. See you soon, gentlemen." Casey gave them both a smile and a wave, and they left. "Well, Drew, let's collect my things and we can be off too." The two men made their way upstairs to the inspector's room, where everything was packed and ready to go. There was no hint of the bathroom's conversion the previous night, save for a vague smell of developing fluid. Drew gave the air a tentative sniff, trying to place the odour. "What is that I can smell?" he asked, unable to identify it. "Developing fluid," the inspector replied simply. "Oh, that reminds me." The inspector opened his case and removed the photographs he had developed the previous evening. "Here are the photographs you took on Sunday night." He handed them to Drew. At the sight of the first photograph, Drew's face turned pale. He walked uneasily over to the bed and sat down. Those lights!" This was the first photograph he had taken that night of the body laid on the ground. Steam could just be seen as the body quickly cooled. In the background, amongst the trees and barely discernible due to the angle, there was not just one set of lights, but dozens, all pointed ovals on their sides. "Those are the same lights I saw that led me to the body." Drew had recovered slightly from the shock, but the fear from that night that he had been so determined to ignore had taken control of him, so shocked was he by the sight of the photograph. He went on to the next picture, another of the body. Again, hidden in the background amongst the trees were the lights. They were of varying sizes and arranged in pairs. Drew shook his head in shock, wanting to look away, but compelled to look at every single picture he had taken. "I can't shake the compulsion to say that they look like—" Drew trailed off, afraid to admit what seemed so glaringly obvious. "Like what, Drew?" the inspector asked. He had noticed the change in him. He could sense his fear. "Eyes," Drew admitted, though it was difficult for him to say it out loud. "They look like eyes, watching me." "That was my first impression as well. You say you didn't notice anything when you were taking the photographs?" "Nothing like this. The trees were far too dark to see into. The flash illuminated things for an instant, but I could make out nothing but trunks." Drew turned to the next picture. This one he had taken of the trees. Dotted between them were the eyes, all around him, all staring towards him. "They were watching me." Drew swallowed against the lump in his throat, trying to force it back into the pit of his stomach. "I felt like I was being watched, but—" He trailed off again as his mind tried to put some kind of meaning to the photographs. "Inspector, what are they?" "That is the question. I've tried to fathom some logical explanation as to what they might be, but have so far not found one. The similarity to eyes is quite disarming. I'm hoping this says something more about our psyche. I hope it is our minds looking to place a familiar tag onto something inexplicable, trying to give us an explanation no matter how unnatural it appears." Drew could not tear his attention away from them. They were the same eyes that had haunted his dreams for the previous 2 nights. "I hope you're right. The idea of there being something in the trees that night watching me fills me with dread." "Quite. Drew, you're a brave fellow, and I've been most impressed with your demeanour since I arrived here." "Thank you, Inspector," Drew replied, somewhat taken aback by the sudden mission. "With this in mind, and knowing how eager you are to help with the case and find explanations for the things that you have witnessed, I feel I must ask you to do something that you may not be completely willing to do. You are willing to say no, of course." "Oh, what is it, Inspector?" "We must return to the scene of the body, to the clearing in the wood. We must go today, while we have daylight, to see if we can find any traces of what might have been picked up by the lens. We will take with us the same camera and a new roll of film to see if we can again capture what it is that you didn't see, but that the camera did see." Drew thought for a moment. The idea of returning to the scene would not have bothered him as much if he had not seen the pictures. "The thought of returning does not immediately fill me with joy," Drew admitted. "However, I need to know what these things are. If you think there is a chance of finding out by reenacting my actions, then so be it." "Capital. Drew, your conviction to uncover the truth that surrounds these events is quite admirable, and I am sure it will stand you in good stead in the future." The inspector put on his coat and picked up his case. "Firstly, we must go to the station at Nettlewood. I'm expecting a package. Shall we struggle downstairs with these? I feel poor Harold has been put through quite enough this morning without me troubling him with this as well." The 2 men handled the luggage with some effort back down the stairs and to the reception, where the inspector rang the bell for service. Presently, Abigail appeared. With all breakfast served, she had abandoned the penny until lunch. "Hello, gents. I trust your breakfasts were all right, seeing as there were 2 empty plates waiting for me." "Indeed, I will miss your cooking, Abigail." "Glad to hear it, though it's Harold that does all the cooking. I'll pass on your compliments." She spied the bags. "So, are you ready to check out, then?" "I am indeed," the inspector replied. "Very well." She leant under the counter to remove the inspector's bill, then edited up the few lines on it. "That'll be £13 and 8 shillings, please." The inspector removed his wallet and took out £15. "Here you are. Please keep the change. The least I could do for leaving you earlier than expected." "Well, it is very generous of you." She passed the visitor's book his way. "Could you just sign here for me, please?" The inspector obliged, leaving an illegible signature where indicated. "Thank you, and here's your receipt." She passed him a piece of paper. "Lovely to have you stay with us." "Thank you, it was a pleasure. Shall I get Harold to help you to the car with your bags?" "Oh, no need. Drew and I will manage. Good day, Mrs. Fothergill." The inspector tipped his hat to her. "Yes, good day, Inspector," she replied, and the two men made their way to Drew's squad car. Chapter 21. Nettlewood Police Station was a short drive through the cold fog along the quiet roads of Nettlewood. Drew was still a little shaken by the photographs, but he shook the feeling off and concentrated on the task ahead. "Did you say you were expecting a package to be delivered, Inspector?" Drew asked as he pulled up at a junction. "Yes, I'm not sure if it would make any difference to the investigation, but it could give us a clue to the origin of the eye-shaped lights. I'm drawing up a hypothesis, and the package should help me determine if I'm on the right track." Drew waited for further explanation, but the inspector took it no further. He wondered if he should press for more details, or if the hypothesis was still too vague or too confusing for him to understand it. Presently they arrived at the station. Nettlewood was a bigger town than Firestone, so the station was bigger, with a busier workforce. They parked in one of the free parking bays at the front, next to another police car which the inspector recognised. This station was a purpose-built, low red brick building with cells at the back. "I see our friend Sergeant Gates is here," he pointed out to Drew. "You recognise the car?" Drew asked. He was surprised, but realised he shouldn't be. "Yes, let's hope he has the kettle on, shall we?" They entered the police station to find a waiting room empty, save for an elderly gentleman sitting on one of the benches. The walls were neatly lined with notices regarding property that had been found and was awaiting the arrival of its owner, and posters advising people to keep their doors locked at night and various other useful bits of advice. The window to the reception desk was currently unmanned, and as they approached it, a door to the left of it opened and a constable appeared. "Oh, hello, Drew. Nice to see you." The man nodded to Drew respectfully. He was middle-aged, so had a few years' advantage on him, and wasn't dressed in full uniform, but had a dark blue sweater over his shirt. "Morning, Jeff. We're here to see Sergeant Gates." "Right you are. Coming back to us finally, are you?" Drew smiled. "Not just yet. Not now things are starting to get exciting over in Firestone." "Yes, bit of a turn-off for the books, all this, isn't it?" Jeff smiled at the inspector. "Indeed it is. I'm the inspector down from the yard." "Yes, I guessed you were. Glad to have you here to help, Inspector." Jeff held the door open for them, and they passed through into the office area of the station. "See you later, gents," he called as they passed through, and as the door closed behind them they heard Jeff address the elderly gentleman in the waiting room. "Now then, Mr. Harris, how can I help?" The office had a low hum of activity buzzing around it. Men sat at desks, smoking cigarettes and writing reports. Telephones rang awaiting an answer. A low haze of smoke surrounded the scene, giving the impression that it was busier than perhaps it actually was. Drew led them to Frank's office and knocked on the door. "Come," called a loud voice from inside. Drew opened the door and they stepped inside. Frank looked up distractedly from the report he was reading, and when he saw who it was entering his office, he immediately disregarded it. "Drew! Good to see you, lad. Come in, sit down. How are you?" His concern for his nephew was palpable. This was the first time they had seen or spoken to each other since parting company the previous day, so Frank was eager to make sure he was well. "I'm doing okay, Sarge, thanks," he told him reassuringly. Drew entered urgently and arranged himself with the air of someone who knew the room well. The office was well lit. The blinds over the frosted windows were pulled up and allowed the room to be filled with a bright natural glow. Frank Gates' large wooden desk sat by the window facing the door. It had an in-tray filled with files that sat awaiting attention amongst the paperwork, and a desk tidy overflowing with pens. On one side of the desk sat Sergeant Gates's chair, and on the other sat a single chair for visitors. "Good morning to you too, Inspector. How is everything?" "Very well, thank you. I'm expecting a rather important package to arrive in a few minutes. Could you please make sure you have someone at the front desk when it arrives?" he asked nicely. "There should be someone on there all day, but I'll make sure it's not left." Frank immediately picked up the telephone and dialed a number. "Jake, it's me. Make sure there's someone on reception if Jeff's busy, will you? We're expecting an important visitor." Frank paused while the man on the other end spoke. "Someone for the inspector. I'm sure you'll know him when you see him. He'll have a package with him. Thanks." He hung up again. "Thank you," the inspector nodded to Frank. "No problem." Frank dismissed it lightly. "Now, how did your search for the clearing go?" the inspector asked. "Not well, I'm afraid. We found no traces of anybody, apart from those left behind by us and Drew the previous night. No footprints, nothing." "Well, thank you for checking." The inspector sounded satisfied, as if this was the answer he had been expecting, the answer he had wanted. "Could I trouble you for a cup of tea?" he asked. "Of course. Where are my manners?" Frank stood to go to the kitchen, but the inspector waved him down with a calm movement of his hands. "Please, allow me. If you point me in the direction of the kitchen, I will make us all one." Drew and Frank did little to hide their surprise. "Out of the office, turn right, room at the end, next to the gents' loo," Frank directed him in a quiet shock. "Wonderful.
I feel I need to make a visit there as well. Back in a moment, gentlemen, he informed them, and made his way politely out of the office. Chapter 22. Well, that was unexpected, Frank commented as the inspector closed the door behind him. Why do you think he went? I told him all about Banks and Dad. He probably wanted to give us a few minutes to chat alone. The two men sat down. Do you think so? Yes, he's really quite intuitive. Well, why did you tell him about your dad? Frank asked, concerned. I'm not sure. He has a way of getting information out of people, almost as if he knows it already, but is waiting for you to say it. What did he make of it? He thinks there's something in it. He wants me to check Mum's house, see if Dad left anything that might be useful. Well, that's good news. What did he make of Banks? Frank asked. I don't know what he thinks, but I don't think he trusts him. Well, he has a strange way about things, Frank told him, a little bitterly, getting me to check the area for clues. He seemed to know we wouldn't find anything. I think he wanted that done to make sure. He knew you wouldn't turn anything up, but he had to do it. Frank shook his head. So what have you two been up to? Frank leant forward on his desk, lowering his voice. Drew looked away, avoiding his uncle's eyes, and shifted awkwardly in his seat. He made me sign some papers, he admitted grudgingly. I'm not supposed to discuss anything about it with anyone outside of the yard. Actually, I'm not supposed to discuss it with anyone outside of his department. His department? Yes, he wasn't really clear about what his department is, but it appears they investigate the cases where there is no easily accepted answer, the cases where nothing adds up to a normal explanation. Frank thought for a moment. He was disappointed he couldn't get a full report on what had been happening. Well, I don't want you risking anything on my part, he replied understandingly. I'm concerned for your well-being, but that's more of a personal judgment than a professional one. Tell me what you can, if you want to. Drew was relieved that he wasn't going to try and force anything out of him that would make the situation any harder for him. I want to tell you everything, but I don't want to endanger either of us. All I can say for sure is that there are things happening in Firestone, in the trees, which I can't explain, things I've seen that I wish I hadn't. What they have to do with this body, I don't know. What they have to do with Banks, if anything, I couldn't even begin to guess. All we can do is put our trust into the inspector, hope he knows what he is doing, and follow his orders. Frank sat back in his chair and sighed. I'm sorry, Drew. I can't help but feel it's because of me you're in this situation. His concern was growing for him every day, especially with stories like these. Don't worry, Frank. I have a feeling the situation was here long before either of us came along. It just took me to witness it, and your guidance to bring someone in who might be able to make some sense of it all. Frank opened his mouth to say something else, but there was a knock at the door, and the inspector entered without waiting for Frank to invite him in. Chapter 23. Here we are, gentlemen. The inspector carried a tray with 3 chipped mugs and a steaming pot balanced on it. He pretended not to notice that the conversation had ceased mid-flow at his reappearance. He placed the tray on top of some papers on Frank's desk. I must say your staff are most friendly and helpful, the inspector commented to Frank. I expect they would be to a man from the yard, Inspector. You should hear some of the back chat I get from them. Yes, I often wondered if my presence brings out hitherto unseen wonders in officers' demeanour. Drew picked up a spare chair from the corner and moved it over to the desk of the inspector. Ah, thank you, Drew, the inspector said gratefully. He took his seat and began to pour. Now, while we wait for my package, I was wondering, was there anything you could tell me regarding Banks that you think I may find interesting? I'm sure Drew used your time alone to bring you up to speed as best he could. Drew shot Frank a smile at his correct assumption. Well, he told me you were interested to know if there was anything his father might have left in way of information about Banks. Yes. Oh, how is that going, by the way, Drew? I'm planning to call her this evening. It was too late to call by the time I got home last night. Good show. Now, Sergeant, I know you hold a low opinion of Banks. Admittedly, from what little I have witnessed of his means, there has been little I have liked. Yes, well, it's hard to treat any man you suspect of murdering your brother with any respect. Frank's tone had taken a dark turn at the line of questioning, though this was more at the subject matter than at the inspector. Understandably, the inspector replied, picking up his mug. He had a way of brushing over people's personal feelings in order to get to the point at hand. Have you ever been given any other reason to think that there may be more behind his behaviour? Like what? Frank asked. Well, you tell me, the inspector asked. Frank thought for a moment. Well, as I explained to you yesterday, he seems a joke with the neighbouring forces. Some of us question whether a force is even required in Firestone, as there's so little crime there it hardly warrants one. The inspector raised an eyebrow. Could this be because the force he has does such a good job? The inspector asked, knowing this wasn't a true proposition, but trying to urge Frank into revealing more. I feel it is more to do with the crime that is committed going unreported, or at least not reported any higher than Banks. The force is good at keeping things under wraps over there. The inspector presumed he was referring to his brother's car crash. Well, I am planning to visit Sergeant Banks again today. I am also going to see the mayor, so we can see if he can shed any light onto Banks's activities as sergeant. The mayor? Why? The mayor is the sergeant's alibi for the evening the body appeared. It would appear he was having a dinner party for some friends. I just need to check this with the mayor. Which reminds me. The inspector removed the list that Banks had written for him the previous day from his jacket pocket. These are the other men from Sunday evening at the mayor's. Banks tells us they all went to school together. Can you think of anything else that might connect these men? Frank took it from him and studied the names. Nothing I can think of. I take it you'll be going to see all these people then? Frank handed the list back. In due course, the inspector replied. The volume of their conversation had dropped to whispers, and they were suddenly interrupted by a sharp rap on the door. Ah, I wonder if this is for me. The inspector stood and opened the door, dispersing the atmosphere of secrecy that had descended over the room. On the other side of the door stood a balding, middle-aged constable. Traditionally, he was called into the room from the desk. He wasn't expecting the door to be opened and jumped slightly at the sight of the inspector. Oh, hello, you must be the inspector. Your delivery has just arrived, he informed him. So kind, constable, thank you. The constable nodded politely and hurried away. Drew, would you mind if I put something in the boot of your car? The inspector asked with a light air. Drew was still consumed by the secrecy of their conversation, and brought himself back to the moment with a blink and a shake of the head. No, of course not, Inspector. He stood, and the three men walked back through the station and into the reception, where the courier was waiting for him. He wore a plain beige uniform which seemed to give the impression that he was a member of the forces, but surrendered no clue as to which force it might be. Good morning, the inspector welcomed him as they entered the room. Good morning. Are you the inspector? Though the answer to this question may have appeared obvious, asking was part of the protocol that the inspector and the courier adhered to. I am, the inspector replied, reaching into an inside pocket of his jacket. May I see some identification, please? The courier asked. Drew and Frank watched quietly. The conversation seemed natural, but there was a feeling of it having been rehearsed. Both had repeated it over and over, though not necessarily with each other. You can, the inspector handed over his wallet of papers. May I? Of course. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his own wallet of papers. The two men studied each other's identification for a moment. That's great, thank you, Inspector. The courier replaced the papers and handed the wallet back to the inspector. Yes, all seems to be in order. The inspector handed the courier back his wallet, and, with formalities over, both men relaxed. Now, shall we see what you have brought me? The courier nodded and led the men out of the police station to a large black van parked on the roadside. The courier opened the back and removed a large brown leather suitcase, not unlike the inspector's large case. Where do you want it? He asked. Can you put it into the boot of Constable Drew's car for me? The inspector motioned to the Zephyr. Yes, of course, he replied, and followed Drew as he rushed round to the back of his car and unlocked the boot for the courier to place the case inside. He made lifting it look easy. Despite its size, it didn't seem to be overly heavy, and it was soon safely in the boot. Drew closed and locked it again. Thank you so much, the inspector thanked the courier gratefully. You're welcome. Were there some reports as well? Yes, of course. Drew, could you open the car for me? Drew obliged happily and unlocked the passenger side door. The inspector reached in and removed his briefcase. He took out of it a brown folder full of papers, a brown envelope that Drew recognised as containing the pictures, and another brown envelope with strange bulges that left Drew wondering. There's also the information you requested. The courier reached into the front seat of the van and removed a thick file for the inspector. Thank you. The inspector quickly put the file in his case and replaced it in Drew's car. Anything else, Inspector? The courier asked politely. Not for now, thank you, but I know where you are if I need you. Very good. See you, Inspector. Gentlemen. He nodded respectfully to the policeman, who nodded respectfully back, then returned to the cab of the van and drove away. Wonderful. Well, Drew, now I have what I came for, I think we should pay another visit to Firestone Police Station and see what else we can learn from Sergeant Banks. Yes, Inspector, Drew replied, wondering just what it was the inspector had put into his boot. Goodbye, Sergeant, I will be in touch. Yes, goodbye, Inspector, Frank replied, a little awestruck at the courier, the package, and the inspector's demeanour throughout. See you, Sarge, Drew called to Frank as he climbed into his car. Yes, goodbye, Drew, Frank called after him, hoping for his safety, and wondering just what danger he had put his nephew in. Chapter 24. They arrived at Firestone Station in good time, the roads being clear under a sky darkened by gathering grey clouds. Drew parked his car outside the station where another police car was sat. Another police car, but not the one belonging to Sergeant Banks, the inspector pointed out. No, Drew replied. They sat and looked at the police car for a moment. Do you still want to go in? Yes, let's see who is here, the inspector suggested, climbing out. Drew followed him into the station, where they were met by the desk constable again, still engrossed in his book. The inspector walked purposefully up to his window, but he did not look up. Good morning, the inspector said, rather loudly, disturbing his concentration and alerting him to the fact that he had company. Oh, morning, Inspector. He looked over the inspector's shoulder. Drew, he called to him as he stood to let them in. Good morning. We're here to see Banks, the inspector told him. "Well, you'll be disappointed then, Inspector." He fell back into his chair with a satisfyingly heavy lurch. "He's not here." The two men in the foyer waited for more of an explanation, but it was not forthcoming. Drew was sure he could hear the inspector grinding his teeth as he tried to hold on to his patience. "Would it be too much trouble?" the inspector asked, his demeanour staying charming to the point of whimsy despite the constable's lack of basic etiquette, "to inquire where he might be found?" "Who knows?" the constable shrugged, indifferent to the inspector's authority. "Could be down the Black Prince, or at the bookies in Nettlewood. As far as I know, we've had no calls come in that he would need to be attending to." He was blasé in his betrayal of Banks. As far as he was concerned, these activities were the norm for the senior members of the police force. He neither realised nor cared that he might be compromising his superior officer. "So he likes to drink at the Black Prince, does he?" the inspector noted. "Perhaps you could allow us to enter a little further into the station, in order for us to await his return." The inspector smiled, assuming as polite a tone of voice as he could. The constable sighed a guttural smile of entrenched torture, and began forcing himself from his seat once more. "If I must," he muttered heavily under his breath, and heaved himself back up again. He disappeared through the door and out of his little room, and after a moment the door next to the hatch opened and he reappeared through it. He stood and held the door open for them in a most unwelcoming fashion, heaving more sighs as they entered the station properly. He did not say a word to them as they crossed the threshold, and when they were through he simply returned to his desk, picked up his book, and continued reading. Drew and the inspector shook their heads in shared despondency at the elderly constable's rudeness, and continued down the corridor to the main office, where the three empty desks still sat. There appeared to have been no change in their state. The inspector checked the desks, opened a few drawers on filing cabinets, and picked out some reports. He opened one and began reading. Drew watched him, a picture of calm as he casually pried into the business of the station. "You don't really want to just sit here and wait for Banks, do you, Inspector?" Drew asked, surprised at this rather static course of action. "Indeed not." He put the files back into the cabinet. "I intend to break into Banks's office and have a look around," the inspector replied casually. He paced over to Banks' office and studied the door. He tried knocking on it, but there was no answer. "Just in case," he informed Drew. He tried the handle on the off chance that it might have been open, but, as predicted, it was locked tight. "At least that is one piece of police policy he follows, albeit more likely for his own protection," the inspector said to himself. Drew nodded and watched as the inspector pulled from his case a set of lockpicks. He studied the lock briefly, selected the appropriate pick, and made short work of the lock. "Not that locking these doors makes any difference to anyone determined enough to gain entry," he observed, and pushed the door open. He entered confidently without waiting for Drew, who loitered uncomfortably at the door. "I'll just wait here in case anyone comes in," he suggested. The inspector carried on regardless. The office was poorly lit by dim sunlight filtering through closed blinds. The inspector flicked the light on, but it didn't make much difference to the cold, dark room. He reached into his case again and took out a small torch, which had a surprisingly bright beam. He used it to begin an investigation of the room. It was much like a smaller version of the office which led to it. A desk, a few filing cabinets, a dusty cactus sat on the windowsill. The room smelt strongly of cigarettes, the walls were grey. On one was a picture of the previous sergeant, Banks's father. The inspector crossed the room and studied it. The two men were similar in appearance. The inspector assumed the photograph was taken toward the end of his career, the greying moustache, the tired eyes, the drawn face. This could be a picture of the current sergeant in 10 years' time. He watched over the office, still influencing the movements within. The inspector lifted the picture away from the wall and glanced behind it, but it hid nothing. Actions such as these were more habit than an important part of the investigation. He was used to finding things hidden behind pictures, but this was hardly the place for such extravagance. He left Banks Senior on the wall to watch him as he opened and closed the drawers of the filing cabinets. He pulled out a file at random and leafed through it. It was a report of a stolen crate of milk from a milk float. The crate was later found, empty, by the roadside later that week. No perpetrator was ever found. Case was closed. He put it back and opened a few more drawers. They were all full of files with similar tales to the one he had pulled out, and the inspector suspected that they all had the same conclusion. He pulled another one out at random and read a few lines of a report about a dead cat found by the roadside. The inspector returned it, bemused. The files were sorted chronologically, and he flicked to the most recent entry, a brief report of a speeding car left a week ago. There was no report of the body or a telephone call from Drew. The inspector closed the drawer, unsurprised by the lack of detail to the biggest crime in the town's history. He flicked to the earliest records, which began 20 years ago when Banks took over from his father. The inspector wondered where the earlier files might be kept. He abandoned the filing cabinets for now and moved to the desk. His eyes skimmed over the assorted, untidy papers strewn across it. He found on the desk that Banks had written out part of a report form and had started to document the beginnings of an account of his actions on Sunday night. The inspector read through it. There was no mention of what he had said during his telephone conversation with Drew. His report simply stated that a telephone call was received, who it was from, and what it had been about. He turned his attention to the drawers, retrieving his lockpicks from his case and deftly picking their locks. The first drawer was full of stationery and notepads full of scrawled notes that yielded nothing interesting. The next drawer down was fit to burst with paper, notes, pens, nothing of any relevance. The bottom drawer contained a bottle of scotch, partially consumed, and the evidence of a dedicated nicotine addiction. Empty cigarette packets, boxes of matches, and a filthy ashtray spilling its contents were all that occupied it. The inspector closed the drawer again and took a look around the dusty old room. He picked up the telephone and dialed a few numbers. Drew watched him and listened, intrigued as to whom he might be telephoning. The inspector dialed the same long series of numbers he had in the Green Man and stood waiting for an answer.